Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by and welcome to the Reactions to Ferguson from Arch City Defenders webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Afterwards, we'll conduct a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Wednesday, December 3rd, 2014. I would now like to turn the conference over to Michelle Rodriguez of the National Employment Law Project. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So as you know, today's webinar is going to include a presentation from Thomas Harvey, who is the co-founder and executive director of Arch City Defenders. And if you don't know, Arch City Defenders, it's an organization that provides criminal and civil legal services to the homeless and working poor in the St. Louis region. And then after we hear from Thomas, we're going to turn it over to our panel of guests, and we're going to have a conversation about Ferguson. But for now, Thomas, I'll turn it to you.
Okay, thanks, Michelle, and I appreciate everyone signing up to listen to this. So my name is Thomas Harvey. I'm the executive director and co-founder of Arch City Defenders. And as Michelle said, we provide criminal and civil legal services to the indigent in the region. We also connect our clients to social services. So our main goal is to remove the legal barriers that prevent people from getting into housing, job training, and treatment that they need to get off the streets and on with their lives. And our connection with what's going on in Ferguson right now is that we had written a paper. We've been doing this work since 2009, and what our clients have told us since the very first day we've done the work is they are being stopped by police in their cars or while they're walking on the streets because they are black, and they are being harassed and exploited because they are poor. And when the combination of those two things is together, they say no one is listening to them when they say they are unable to pay fines stemming from the low-level interaction with the police that they've had. So since the very first day, we've been representing people who had been pulled over for a traffic violation, a speeding ticket, a driving with a suspended license, a no proof of insurance, things like that. And if you haven't read about our local governmental structure, we've got St. Louis County is comprised of 90 separate municipalities, 81 of which have their own court, 63 of which have their own police force. So I can just give you one quick example of what daily life is like for folks living in this region. On the street I live on, if I turn out of my driveway and make a right onto Natural Bridge Road, I travel 3 miles. I drive through 8 different municipalities within a span of those 3 miles. And for poor people in our region, this essentially becomes a gauntlet for them where they are pulled over and harassed, ticketed, fined exorbitant sums, and then put on essentially a pay docket that required their contact with the courts for years to come. Fines can be as much as $2,000 for some of these cases. They're offered payment plans that they can make $50 a month payments, but of course that's 3 years of payments at $50 a piece, at $50 a month. And what our clients have told us since the beginning is this isn't about public safety, it's about the money. They've told us that they were denied access to the courts by the bailiff and the police, by the police as well as the judge and prosecutor in the court. So this most typically happens when a client of ours is a working person who is going to court at night. These are part-time courts at night, and they come to court and they're unable to get child care, and so they bring their children with them to go to court to make their payment. And as they approach the door, the bailiff says, well, Mom, you can come in, but you can't come in with your children. And so then the person's faced with the choice of entering the court without their children and leaving them on the parking lot with hopefully someone they know, or not going into court, the consequence of which is getting a warrant for their arrest. So up until 3 months ago, there were signs on at least 20 of our regional courts' doors saying children were not allowed, and that only defendants were allowed in the courtroom. So warrants for arrest have come from that interaction also. They wouldn't go into court because they couldn't go in with their kids, and they got a warrant for their arrest as a result of a failure to appear. The other thing that our clients have told us is that they are being incarcerated due to their inability to pay fines. So the most common manifestation of this is people being pulled over, given a traffic ticket, they're given a court date, and then they don't appear on the court date, whether it's for the reason I just described or any other reason. They don't appear on the court date. They get a failure to appear, a warrant is issued for their arrest, and then when they are driving, because no one stops driving here because we lack a comprehensive public transportation system, and they're driving, they're pulled over again, and they are held in jail until the next court date. And because these are part-time courts, this can sometimes be 2 weeks to a month before court meets again. They're given the option of posting a bond, but the bond is the exact dollar amount of the fines that they were assessed that they couldn't afford to pay. So in the case of a person who's got a $2,000 bond, $2,000 in fines, they're told that they can get out if they pay the $2,000 bond. So then they sit and they're brought before the judge, and the judge says, I know you really want to leave, so go ahead and pay this bond. And they say, we can't because we are indigent. And what is happening frequently in our backyard is they are continuing to be incarcerated even after they've told the judge that they're indigent and cannot pay the fines, and that's why they've been sitting in jail for 2 weeks. And that had happened to our clients who were living in homeless shelters. That had happened to people who were on disability, people who were living in Section 8 housing. They've been incarcerated after a moment where the judge examined their finances, and they continue to incarcerate them. So the connection for our work to the killing of Mike Brown is people ask why was the reaction so strong after this killing? And from our client's perspective, this was a moment where the elected officials needed some political capital. There was a killing. It was as of yet unexplained, and they were coming to the community and saying, give us some time, trust us, we're going to get to the bottom of this, and we're going to get to the right answer. And for our clients' minds, the same people who are asking them to trust them have been arresting them because they're black and incarcerating them because they're poor for the last 50 years. And so there was a great deal of distrust, not only between police and members of the community, but also between the courts, which for most of the people we represent, their government is the courts and the police. They don't see the mayor. They don't see the city council members. They see who they come in contact with the most is the police officer that's pulled them over, or their children over, or their father over, or their brother over every day of their lives since they've been living in these small towns. So that, and I attended the first city council meeting after Mike Brown's death, and this was just really a airing of grievances in many ways, and 1 out of every 3 people who spoke that evening made reference to this excessive police force, over-policing, and the criminalization of poverty. Many people said they had called the police in response to a crime that had been committed at the next door neighbor's house or at their house, and that they were arrested on traffic tickets when the police came to their house to investigate that incident. So it was there that we saw it was even broader than the homeless and the indigent that we were representing. This was the experience of a great deal of people in Ferguson. And just so we're clear, Ferguson is a small town of 21,000 people. It is bordered by Florissant, Pine Lawn, Jennings. It's just a whole slew of small municipalities are right next to it. So the police that patrol Ferguson are the same police that patrol these other regions as well. So there's really no distinction made by our clients among the police in Ferguson versus police in other municipalities. So their experience, it's a bigger issue than just Ferguson. it's a regional problem, and in part of it is because of the near presence of 90 municipalities, 83 of which with their own court. So Arch City Defenders became more involved in some of the legal representation of folks who were protesting. Subsequent to the death of Mike Brown, there was been widespread protesting and organized and spontaneous, you name it, and people have been arrested. And so we were getting calls from protesters who had been arrested in one municipality for protesting, exercising their First Amendment rights, and they were asked to disperse. They were arrested by that town, and then they would find out they had warrants for their arrest in, 7 or 8 different of these towns across the region, and they didn't know how to navigate that system. So we became an important player in representing people who have been protesting simply by helping them navigate this system that was impacting more to sort of people who made a little more money than our clients did, but had never had this type of experience before. So they were arrested in one town, and then they would do what we call the muni shuffle, which means they were bouncing from one jail to another jail for a week, trying to get out because they had unpaid traffic tickets in other towns. So Arch City Defenders became involved in trying to help them navigate that system at that time, and then we have become much more involved with the overall protest movement simply by being in the same rooms with folks when they're talking about their experience with the police. We've helped them a little bit with just where we organized a day where we would recall their warrants for them. People who wanted to go out and protest would come to our office, and we'd run them for a warrant check, and we would help them plan for that day of going out and protesting, because the police were just stopping people and asking for their IDs and then arresting them if they had a warrant, and essentially in an attempt to chill their First Amendment rights and try to disperse the crowd in advance. We've also become involved in, right now we are about to file a preliminary injunction in the federal court to prevent the police from, they've been tear gassing the crowds and issuing orders to disperse, but not giving people, we allege this, that they've been tear gassing the crowds after an order to disperse, but that dispersal order has not given the people protesting any way to comply with the order. So on one of the evenings where I was there, they fired tear gas, and if you wanted to disperse, you walked to your right into a cloud of tear gas, and you walked to your left into a line of police in riot gear. So there was really no way to comply with the order, which ended up in another round of tear gassing. So there are many practices right now throughout the region that our nonprofit 6 months ago would not have been involved in, but now we are actively involved in some of these things simply as an outgrowth of our experience with the people who have been arrested on these low-level municipal court violations. And I think that's the end of my 15 minutes. I'm happy to open it up to the other panelists at this point.
Thank you, Thomas, so much for setting the stage for us. We do have a panel of guests that are going to share their reflections, and we're going to have a discussion about the issues that have been raised in Ferguson. So just to give people a sense of it, on our panel are Roberta Meyers, who's the director of the Legal Action Center's National H.I.R.E Network, Doug Ammar, who's the executive director of the Georgia Justice Project, and also April Frazier-Camara, who's a special assistant of the Juvenile Defense Unit at the Shelby County Public Defender in Tennessee. So I'm going to turn it over to you first, Roberta.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Thomas, for giving such a thorough presentation and backdrop of what's been going on in St. Louis and in Ferguson particularly. I was struck by the various elements of your work, and one of the things that you did talk about a little bit is collaboration, and the role that Arch City has been able to play in dismantling these ineffective and unjust systems and policies. And you started to touch on a lot of key ways that as a legal organization that provides criminal defense and some civil services, different ways that you've been able to interject yourselves in the activity that's been going on. But could you talk a little bit more about how these collaborations are beginning to gel, and how you really see going forward, particularly where you are, but even suggesting other ways that legal organizations can really play a role in a grassroots-based movement in a way that's appropriate and useful to people who are on the ground and in the streets fighting in their communities?
Sure. Yeah, I would say initially, I mean, the biggest thing is we just took seriously what our clients were saying about how they were treated in these courts, and we looked into it and saw that statistics supported that they were being racially profiled and that the courts were exploiting them financially. But after that, after we called attention to some of those things, some of those issues that our clients talked about through the publication of our paper, we got contacted by local organizing groups saying, you know, this has been our radar for years, but no one's ever looked at this. Could we sit down and talk about it? And it turned out that we've had, I mean, there's a group in town called the Organization for Black Struggle that we've worked with on some of these issues, and they're very far left politically. And then there's the St. Louis Tea Party, and each of those organizations has reached out to us to work on reform of the municipal courts. And so this has been something that, for us, it's been an example of how broad-reaching these issues of injustice are, and these issues of abuse of individuals and people and abuse of our constitutional protections are. You've got people all across the political spectrum who are reaching out to us, and so frankly, it was organic. People reached out to us. We are nimble enough that we can go talk to them and see if there's some nexus between their interests and our interests, and continue to work with them as a result of those conversations.
I think that's fabulous. Doug and April, do you want to comment? Doug, first, you might have a question related to this, and then April, if you can jump in.
Well, thanks, Tony. This is Doug Ammar. Thomas, I'm glad you brought up that I was going to ask a question that your comments just a moment ago sort of presaged, and that is the idea of different groups of folks working together, or really I was going to ask how your work, I mean, has it, I guess what I'm asking, has it remained sort of apolitical, or has it remained bipartisan, or are you able to go down the middle, or has this work, especially your paper and sort of lifting all this up, has it pushed you all to one side politically such that it neutralizes some of your power, or has it not, or has it gained power in the sense, in terms of your relationships with other groups in the community? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Yeah, that makes sense. So I would say we're certainly being pushed in the direction right now of being more aligned with protesters in general. Now that's not our organizational goals, but we are when we published the paper, we made a conscious decision to take the risk that getting into this advocacy might impact our ability to be as effective as we were in direct representation. The truth is, since we've published the paper, we've been more effective in our direct representation, whether it's out of recognition that these are serious issues or out of concern that they're going to see their name in the paper. I'm not sure what, but we're getting better results for our clients now than we have in the past. Now, I will tell you that sometimes we're simultaneously being excoriated by a judge or a prosecutor, but they're also just doing whatever we want them to do at this point. And I think perhaps because of our focus is on constitutional rights. I mean, these are serious legal abuses that are occurring in our courts, and there's pretty broad spread agreement that we're right about that. The only players in this system who have spoken out against what we've done are people who stand to gain financially. And again, as I said, people from across the political spectrum have reached out to us. Probably the most conservative member of our legislature is sponsoring a bill right now to reduce the cap that these municipal courts can gain from the revenue in the courts from 30% to 10%. And it's as a result that he talks openly about our paper bringing attention to the issue.
Great. April?
Hi. Thanks, Tony. This is April Frazier-Camara. As a public defender office here in Shelby County, a part of our collaboration with the community is really centered around being client-centered. As a public defender, we have to listen to the community we serve in order to be client-centered. So I see it as a natural part of what our responsibility is as public defenders, but also to take it a step further, when we see issues pop up, I think it's also important to educate and empower our clients to understand the process. Oftentimes, we're in a bind to explain to clients that their options are limited based on the legislation or what the laws are in the state or the jurisdiction. So the more that clients understand that we as public defenders cannot solve the problem, it's up to them to contact their policymakers to change the laws. I think we serve a very important role in explaining to our clients the distinction between the two as far as legislative versus the court system. And I wanted to follow up on the issue of fines and fees. Memphis, like other cities in the South, mirror Ferguson, Missouri regarding the criminalization of poor people through excessive court fines and fees. Basically, poor people are being forced to fund the unjust criminal justice system that oftentimes entraps them. For example, in Tennessee, for you to file a motion to expunge a criminal record, the filing fee is $350 to $450. For you to file for restoration of voting rights or civil rights, the filing fee is $163. And we recently passed a bill for certificate of employability to help people overcome the employment barriers based on criminal records. And there is even a fee assessed to filing for those certificates, which will range around $150. So can we talk a little bit, and Thomas, I would like to hear from you first, what can we do as a community to fight back against these excessive court fees and to address these types of injustices?
Well, that's a great question, and I wouldn't presume to speak on behalf of everybody in the audience, but the one thing we did is just shared our information, right? So we, again, it was our clients telling us this is not about the money. This is not about public safety. It's about the money that got us to look at the budget for the towns where they were being arrested. So when we looked at Ferguson, for instance, it's a town of 21,000 people with a budget, overall budget of just over $20 million, and they collect, 14 million, and they collect $2.7 million a year in revenue from their court fines and fees. So once we started looking at those numbers, it was kind of unavoidable that this was not just, our clients were right, this was not about public safety, this was about a huge source of revenue. It was the second highest source of revenue in the town after sales tax. And we just put that information together and put it out there. Now, if you don't, I would say that this is the type of thing that could go to the media. People in our town were very interested in this. It wasn't a new issue of these courts were not an issue of first impression. People have known about this forever. There was an article written about this in 1966 outlining many of the same things. So just continuing to share it would be one way. And having, I think, the connections to human beings who've suffered the negative consequences of those financial burdens were the most important thing. Because you can put out all the numbers you want, but if you've got somebody saying, I lost my job as a result of this, or I couldn't get a job as a result of it, or I lost my housing, it's very powerful. Doug, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I guess I had a question, and going along with what April brought out, and that, Thomas, your old shop and our shop are similar in the sense that we're independent nonprofits, unlike April, who's the public defender. And I guess what I was wondering as it relates to fines and fees, For years, we in our office, Georgia Justice Project, when we represent folks, we ask a judge to waive fines and fees because they know, the judges know, and we remind them that we're representing folks who are poor. And I guess my question is sort of twofold. One, have you all had any success with that in your all's work in St. Louis? I mean, are judges willing to do that at all? And again, I go right to the judges and skip past the prosecutors generally. But also, too, do you think being a private group or not part of the government, if you will, gives you any extra leverage to make that argument or willingness for a judge to go along with it?
That's a good question. On the second question, I'm not sure. I tend to think the reason folks went along with some of the suggestions we made on an individual basis was because of the people we represented and the stories of their lives that we talked about when we went and talked to the prosecutor and the judge. So if you're talking about a homeless population, by definition, they don't have the money. Now, there were still people who didn't listen to that, and that's why we ended up writing a paper. But I'm not sure that whether or not it was public or private has made much of a difference. I will say that the fact that we are small and a private group allows us to be more nimble and to think about these things and to spend the time to write the paper, which has then helped us create some momentum to get some real change.
What I find, and this is Roberta Meyers, nicknamed Tony for those who haven't quite figured that one out yet. I think what strikes me about these court fines and fees. Back in May, NPR released the results of a survey that they did of the state court system, and found that in at least, and this is what they reported, in at least 43 states plus the District of Columbia, a defendant could be billed for needing and using a public defender. And I mean, to start from a place like that, and then when you talk about the cycle of poverty, when you talk about, Thomas, when you worded it, getting arrested for being black and being incarcerated because you're poor, I think it just brought to mind for me the depth of the systemic problems we have to be able to address. And so for me, it just takes it, okay, so we're definitely going to have to talk about the next steps. And it's exciting to me to see how putting that report together, Arch City putting that report together, how it's now, developing and growing into a bigger movement in addition to the tragedy that happened. But there's some tools out there, and I just wanted to also point out the Brennan Center had put together a toolkit for organizations around the country to utilize if they want to begin a campaign around debt reform, because that is, and I thought that there were some great tools that we all could be thinking about utilizing and maybe enhancing in some way as work is progressing around the country. And so I just wanted to point that out, that how looking at that, I just was struck by, what it looks like in St. Louis, but also around the country, how this is happening. And so I don't know, Doug, did you want to go on to about systemic impact?
Sure, I will. Thanks, Tony. Well, I was actually in a meeting yesterday, folks, and it was a bunch of nonprofit folks, and it was being run by a foundation. And the foundation sort of delivery was all about race and impact and equity, and trying to orient, their funders, the fundees, to sort of take a racial lens, if you will, or how could we move some needles on the issue of racial disparities. And one of the, of course, I thought most powerful things is they quoted your material, Thomas. They actually quoted the number of people in Ferguson, and yet, the 20-some thousand, yet they had 30,000 arrests or something like that. And I got up after it. I went up to the presenter, and she didn't know where. She found that somewhere else, didn't know about you guys. But my point only is that they were using that data to make this point about racial disparities and economics. And again, I just thought it was a great testament to your work of how it's being lifted up in places that you obviously don't even know about. And so that's what I'm interested in. So some of the folks who might be on the call, or even, our organization here in Atlanta and others that are working in some of this criminal justice space, and we're often all pretty small, and you guys are small and relatively new, as you pointed out earlier. And yet I've just been so impressed that you're able to identify a problem, document the issue, and then publish the results, and then have those results lifted up. And I think it's an incredible example, and really could be an encouraging example for groups around the South, really around the country, to not just work on a problem, but take that problem, flesh it out, and lift up the results in a way that creates a deeper conversation. And so I'm interested in this idea of almost sort of like this being a case study for how some of us, and many of us, even on this call, are do direct service, and it's hard to extract yourself from the demanding needs we see every day of our clients to then take this sort of meta perspective, and your all's worked for 2 years in documenting this and the research and the court watching, to then to write it and put it in a place that can have even broader impact. And I guess I'm asking a question in the sense of sort of how hard that was for you all to do, because I would think sort of some of us it is hard to do, to sort of lift out of the everyday work of direct service to focus on something this broad. And here we see a great payoff, that the broadness of your all's approach is having a big payoff, I think. So I'm just curious about how you think about that and how you would encourage others to sort of take this route of doing that kind of hard work, that long-term work that could lead to systemic change.
Sure. So I will say that thank you for saying all that, and I would love to know who that funder is who was talking about our work, because they haven't sent us any money. So, but what I would say is we talked about this issue several years ago. When I met you in Atlanta several years ago, we had just begun, and we had gone to visit you. We visited Southern Center for Human Rights, Southern Law Center, and it was from that trip that this idea of a court watching program was really born. And then we didn't really have the resources to do that right away. So a timeline that probably could have taken a year took 2.5 years for us, because it was a lot of part-time work and doing stuff on the weekends and extra. But the bottom line is we had a frustrating experience, and I'm sure everybody we're talking to has had, where you see the results you're getting for your individual client, but there are people there in the courtroom who are not getting the benefit of your work. And for us, it was more obvious, because we'd go out to these small municipal courts and we'd talk to a prosecutor, and we'd get a prosecutor who said, oh, yeah, I'm a veteran, so I understand. I don't want this homeless veteran to have this financial burden. I'll help him out. But that same prosecutor would look at, that was on one client, right? And there'd be 150 people in line waiting to plead guilty and get assessed a bunch of fines, and they weren't going to get the benefit that he gave our client. And so we just began to feel defeated by the idea that we weren't really making a broader change if we just continued to represent these folks. So it seemed like we felt obligated to do it, and we didn't have the resources to do it. But to be honest, the bare bones way we did it was we went and made a presentation to law students and got them fired up about seeing some of the injustices in their own backyard that they would never see in their classrooms. And those law students went out and documented all this stuff for us with very little guidance from us, thankfully, because we didn't have the time or resources to do it. Then once we got that, we got other interns from law schools and undergraduate programs around the region to help us put it all together, and then we wrote it. It did take a long time. In a perfect world, we would have been done earlier, but the truth is it was not that work intensive once we decided we wanted to do it, and we were willing to farm out some of the work, and that we didn't have to own every sentence of the paper and every court watching questionnaire.
This is April. I just want to chime in just to echo what Thomas said, because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. But I think most of us who do public interest work or public defenders, we're overwhelmed with the day job, but we have to make time to take time to address the systemic issues that we see each day. And one of my former mentors did the analogy of representing an individual client is like emptying the ocean one bucket at a time. And we have to figure out a way, how can we kind of empty the ocean in a more just and larger way. And I think we do that from addressing things systemically.
Absolutely. I think, Thomas, you actually gave a great example of how bringing together the New Southern Strategy Coalition has been so instrumental in bridging all of us in this work and creating a space that that gives an opportunity to share ideas and even spark innovation or new energy to address a lot of the systemic problems that we see in our day-to-day work in our community. So kind of being able to kind of step outside of it and come together and talk about the challenges that are going on in the communities that you're serving, and then going back home and figuring out, some way to deal with it. And so I think you did give a great example of how, you talked about that meeting in Atlanta. It was a New Southern Strategy Coalition meeting, I think, or was it? I think it was.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so how, being able to come together and share ideas have sparked new chances and changes and opportunities and new ways to look at how to strengthen your ability to be effective in the work that you do, and I think that's exciting. And so I think as a final step before we get to the participation of the folks on the webinar. The tragedy in Ferguson was really another wake-up call, I think, of an ongoing tragedy that we've been talking about throughout this webinar that exists in many low-income communities, unfortunately. Aggressive policing and disrespect of its residents, lack of opportunity in education and employment. It's a reflection of what African Americans and Latinos have been experiencing in every region of our country. And today we've talked about the racial and economic bias systems and policies in St. Louis, which we know mirrors many other cities. For example, New Yorkers have fought stop and frisk using research, using community organizing, policy advocacy, and also litigation. And we see some of the same things happening in North Carolina, where the Southern Coalition for Social Justice has been sharing the stories of people being stopped, frisked, and assaulted for driving while black. A term that describes stop and frisk like tactic on the roads. And interestingly, a report was released earlier this year from a research team at the University of Kansas that shares the data of driving while black in Kansas City. And we know that this is just a prevalent activity that's been happening across the country. And what happened to Michael Brown has now really taken it up to the Department of Justice and the White House and forcing them to do something about this. So at this time, I would like for all of us to take a minute, and a minute only so that folks can also put their questions in and we can answer, to take a minute to share what we believe are the next steps for all of us in this movement to ensure fairness and equality in our nation. It's time for us to do what? I'll start, and then Thomas, April, and Doug, if you can answer this as well, it would be great. For me, it's time for us to do what we do even better. We have to tell the stories or create the opportunities for our clients to tell their stories in a more effective way. And I think, Thomas, you alluded to this, more report writing, and Doug, you brought it all home when you described the way that Arch City Defenders has been able to bring this all together. Writing reports about what people are truly experiencing, how the systems we are fighting are not working, and without sugarcoating it. Now's the time to hold the media accountable for what they do and don't report. We have to get more of our local news organizations involved and encourage them to share our work and stories. And my list is long, but I'm going to stop there. So, Thomas, if you can share your thoughts about a next step and take a minute, and then April, if you can follow, and then Doug.
Sure. I would echo what you said. And as far as our next steps, we are looking at some additional papers that cover some of the work that we've been doing for the last 5 years on issues of child support and people being incarcerated as a result of inability to pay child support. But I would also say that we're encouraged that local media and many of the people in our region, they just seem to not have known that the extent of the problem, and they're paying attention now. And I think it's a real opportunity to continue, not to pull back and not to talk about healing, frankly, but rather to keep talking about the problems, because there's more than just what's been revealed here. And the other thing is, I think it's got to be an effort on all fronts. It can't just be advocating for your clients in court and doing direct representation well, and it can't be just limited to media coverage. It's got to be legislation, it's got to be impact litigation, and it's got to be in connection with the people who are directly impacted. So organizing groups are at the center of a lot of the work that we're doing. So, I mean, their desires and their goals are at the center of a lot of the work we're doing. So I think it's important that it remain organic and that we take seriously the concerns of the people we represent on all these fronts.
Hi, Tony, thank you for this opportunity. Actually, when I thought about next steps, I wanted to share something that was shared with me by one of my colleagues about it's time for us to be uncomfortable. As public defenders, we sit in the courtrooms and we see the injustices every day. And you can react to it one or two ways. You can become numb by the process, or you can see it for what it really is. It is grave injustices that we can never become comfortable with as a society. So I'm going to share a quote, and it says, when we have done things one way and we're straining to do them in a new way, there is a hugely important liminal moment. We have to turn off autopilot. We have to really witness our own instincts. We have to be willing to be uncomfortable enough to do things a new way. And I think it's time for us to do things a new way.
Doug?
Well, April, hard to follow that. Goodness. Who's the quote by the way, April?
Of course, I don't know, but I just wanted to give whoever it is credit. It's a very powerful quote.
It is. Thanks. So, I mean, a couple things. You know, I think, first of all, that really because, I mean, not exclusively because, but in large part because of the New Southern Strategy Coalition that we're all a part of, we've learned about Thomas's work, and we've learned about the great work in North Carolina. We've learned about what's happening in Mississippi, and so one of the things I keep thinking about is the more those of us in some of the toughest places doing this kind of work can learn from each other, not just to be encouraged, but really with the ideas and the strategies to apply what we know, to apply principles, to apply best practices to move change faster. That, to me, is one of the things that resonates deeply with me about not just Thomas's work, but I want to know, who else is, it just encourages me to keep the New Southern Strategy Coalition going and keep creating opportunities for us to learn from each other. The other thing, and Thomas did hit on this a little bit, I really believe in the combination of both direct service and sort of a broader impact work as well. We take that approach. We're very intentional about it. Thomas, you guys do too. And I do think, to sort of April's point earlier, not being what I was trying to hint at is what advantages do we have as independent nonprofits that our government friends don't have the opportunity to do. And we do have the chance to have this larger systemic sort of approach. So what I'm encouraged by, and what I hope is that we can encourage other folks who have this ability, this nonprofit status, if you will, the ability to slide around in ways that other folks can't, particularly in criminal justice, to make bigger impact. And the third thing I think a lot about is, and Thomas, I think I've told you this personally, your work and this work is a real challenge to us, is to say, that example you gave of walking into court and seeing what happens to everybody else other than your client is something we see all the time. And so then the question is, how can we can't represent everybody. We can't, do that, but what can we do to make it easier and better for folks going through the system? And that, to me, at the end of the day, is what keeps resonating, is that the lesson from your all's work is that you all have been able to do that with a very small staff, a very young organization, and as you said, with lots of volunteers, just to pull something together. So I keep thinking about leveraging these stories, these examples, leveraging ourselves to make bigger impact, and to get us, some of us who, whatever our approach has been, sort of again referencing sort of April's quote, is to get us out of our sort of liminal state, get us into another way of engaging. That to me is exciting for all of us. And so, Michelle, I think I'm turning it back over to you.
Thanks, Doug. This is our time for the question and answer session, so this is when we open it up. For audience members, please do type in your questions. You've got that chat box, and we're going to answer it as panelists. And just a small reflection, I just want to appreciate all of the panelists for participating in this and having this conversation. I know I personally, when I was watching the news on Ferguson with the lack of the indictment, I honestly was just kind of numb and feeling really depressed about the state of our country and where we are. And this has kind of been a cathartic, webinar in terms of it, thinking of more hopeful spaces and not just giving in to feeling numb. So I really appreciate everybody's thoughts on that. And we do have one first question, which is more about how to become involved with the New Southern Strategy Coalition. And maybe I'll turn that over to you, Doug, if you want to share with audience members of how they can join and what's the purpose behind the coalition and how they can better participate.
Sure. Actually, I saw that question and I'm so excited. First of all, the coalition is only a few years old, and the purpose of the coalition is really, again, just to bring folks together in the South who are working on primarily collateral consequence issues, the impact of the criminal justice system with an eye towards how to reduce those negative impacts and really limit the impact of the criminal justice system generally. And the thought was, in the South, we have the largest number of folks arrested, charged, incarcerated. We have the largest, percentage of African Americans in the country. All these sort of things lead to us having the worst of the situation, but at the same time, what works up in the Northeast, what works in the West Coast, isn't necessarily going to work in South Carolina or Georgia or Mississippi. And we've seen that in our own policy work here in Georgia. And so the thought is, if we can find out what works in Memphis and what works in North Carolina, then we might be able to translate some of those lessons, whether it be on a direct service level, whether it be on a policy level, whether it be on an organizing level, to the work we're doing similarly situated here in Georgia. So the idea is to accelerate change in the South by learning best practices from folks in the South. So the way you can get involved, the first thing to do, we have our new website that is up and going. I'm actually sitting here with Kenneth Westbury, who's on our staff, who is from South Carolina. I'm the person asked from South Carolina. So our website for the New Southern Strategy is newsouthernstrategy.org. It just went live a few weeks ago, a month ago. And there's a way to log in. There's a place called Join Us on the front page. You can click on that, and it'll start the process. So that's the easiest way to get involved.
Tony, did you want to make any comment on that?
I didn't. Doug covered pretty much everything, but we need all the help that we can get. Michelle and I are representing two national organizations, but we would love to have the support and participation of a number of organizations, because the real idea is to share ideas and share, share information so that people are not recreating the wheel, wasting very limited and scarce resources, and also to build a supportive network in the region and around the country to deal with these complex issues. I think we touched on the complexity and the roots behind the systems that we're working to dismantle, and so it's going to take all of us to do it. And so if we can all continue to come together and coalesce and share our ideas and thoughts and support each other, I think we'll have a better chance of being effective and victorious in meeting these challenges. So just really excited that this coalition has gotten off the ground and that we've been trying to travel through the region to engage more organizations and stakeholders who are interested in getting involved, and hope that you will do that.
Thanks for that, Tony. And we have another question here. So this is going to be for all of the panelists as well. It's a good question. How do we educate, alert, and prepare communities, especially low-income communities who aren't going to be as plugged into resources such as the Arch Defender report and articles or even media coverage about the issues in the courts prior to interaction with the police? So basically, as Doug said, how do we make it easier to equip people to address and avoid these issues?
Michelle, this is April. I wanted to take a stab at that because I really struggle with that question as I advocated for reform with collateral consequences and other criminal justice issues. I think we have to find a way to have these conversations around the dinner table. I know oftentimes I wouldn't bring it up when I was at home with family because, I wanted to turn it off. But I think as we engage people, if we can't convince our own family members and friends that this is the right thing to do and they have a stake in the outcome of how our communities are being oppressed or being impacted, then I don't know. I just think it starts with us being able to frame these conversations and have them with people that we love and our friends and family. And the reason I say that is because we have to get people to understand that their fate is tied to the fate of communities who are being underserved and oppressed. And so I think we have to start there. And I know it's not always easy to do, but we have to start framing these conversations one-on-one, changing one heart at a time to get them not only to understand, but actually want to advocate to do something about it.
Thank you, April. Doug, did you have a comment on this?
I do. This is Doug. That's a great question. One of the things we have done in the last few years that was never, let me frame this. Our organization is 28 years old. We got kind of seriously on the collateral consequence work starting about 10 years ago and very aggressively about 7 years ago, and at the same time got into policy work. Up to that time, we never had sort of a campaign and effort to go out and talk to people, right? We were responsive, and we were overwhelmed with requests, being a small nonprofit offering our services free, the only alternative to the public defender really in the entire state. I mean, we were doing something that wasn't offered out in the community, so we sort of felt, besieged, which we were or are, so we did not sort of take what we knew out into the community. When we started to affect change politically and legislatively, that's when we said, well, we've got to let folks know about these changes in the law. And so what's happened in our organization is a very aggressive shifting. We still do the work. We still represent folks. But we have, to put this in perspective, last year alone with a small staff, we gave almost 60 presentations last fiscal year around the state of Georgia that touched over 2,500 people, directly affected people. So in those presentations, it's geared a lot around obviously criminal justice, but particularly collateral consequences, and sort of equipping people. We're talking more and more about voting and about the legislative process, so folks can take their rights and move with them. And we're trying to empower folks because we cannot represent the 4 million people in Georgia who have a criminal record. So for us, there's been a pretty big shift about taking what we know and taking not just what we do, but what we know, and trying to share that at the highest and broadest level. We actually even hired a video company recently to come and videotape some of our training so we can give those to other nonprofits so folks don't have to rely on even seeing us in person to get information. And, of course, websites and those things are obviously in place. So for me, what I think about is Thomas kept using the word flexibility, and I think that's what small or nonprofits have, flexibility to pivot. And we as an organization have taken that flexibility and pivoted in the last few years to particularly around this we call the education component, implementation component of our work. And as Tony knows, because she was just in the office a few weeks ago, we're having more and more gatherings here at our. We're doing all kinds of things to sort of put the word out, to train, educate people. So for me, that's what I think about, is how we, those of us in the work, which are often overwhelmed and under-resourced, but this whole sort of level of energy that comes when you start to turn a little more outward, particularly if you're a direct service organization, to engage on this sort of public level of dialogue. I hope that's responsive.
Absolutely. Thomas, do you have a comment to share?
Yeah, I would love to address that. So I would echo what Doug said, that we do a fair amount of community outreach as well, and we do focus it on nonprofits that are serving poor people who have legal issues. We do it in schools as well. But the other thing I would say is, in addition to that work, we've been pretty active on social media, and that's been a way that we've been able to take some of the work that we do and some of the rights of folks that we represent directly to some of the impacted communities. That's not always as effective, but that's one way to get a broad message out quickly. And then we've done some radio programs with community radio that's been pretty effective in getting out the word about rights in courts. The other thing I would say is, it's just as important as it is to try to educate the directly impacted folks about their rights. I think it's important to talk to judges and prosecutors and cops and government officials, and that's something that we've been spending more time simply through trying to get them to understand what it's like, what a day in the life is like for our clients, so that they're not so quick to dismiss someone when they say, well, it took me an hour to get here by public transportation, and I really wish you wouldn't issue a warrant for my arrest because I'm 20 minutes late to court. I mean, there's a quick trigger on the part of some judges who've never, ever set foot on a bus or the metro. And another, there's some easy things like that, which I know all of us know about our clients, that there's this huge gap in understanding between people sitting behind the bench and the people standing in front of the bench. So that education, that different way of thinking about education, I think is really important, especially when we're talking about collateral consequences. I genuinely don't believe a lot of the judges and prosecutors that we work with and against have any clue the havoc that they're wreaking in the lives of the people that we represent. And to be able to amplify some of the stories that our clients have told us is very important. So I think that's another way to get that information out, and I think it's just as important.
Thanks so much, Thomas. And we have about 1 minute left, and I want to leave it for Tony, if you would take us to the last comments and perhaps leave us with some inspirational thoughts to take us to the next step.
Okay, well, I can't preach for you all. I hope that everyone has found this conversation to be a solutions-based conversation. I think for all of us, we're bombarded with the negative and the systemic nature of oppression and discrimination and all that we continue to see in doing this work. But we should always continue to strive to identify solutions, and so that's what I hope you've taken away. And I know for me, that's what's been so cathartic with this webinar, is that this conversation has been around identifying ways to come at the numerous challenges that we know we're trying to address professionally, but also I think in our personal lives, based on our own living in the communities that are impacted by all these issues. So hopefully you will join the New Southern Strategy Coalition. We're really working to build a network of support and strength around these issues and education around these issues, and continue to move forward nationally and regionally. So hopefully you found this informational. It's being recorded, so I'm sure it'll be available for folks who want to go back and listen again and digest a lot of the information that's been taken up. Continue to support people in St. Louis and all that's happening there and around the country, and we just keep moving forward and strengthen numbers. Thank you for participating.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you to all of our panelists and audience members.